All right. Good morning, class. Hope you're doing well. Certainly a blessing to be with y'all today. And I'm sorry I haven't been able to. I was. Well, it's just been It's been busy. So that's all I'm going to say about it. So let's get started. We were, looking at the book of Revelation. So now let's talk about those 5 steps in regards to looking at the book of Revelation. So, first step, of course, did this mean to the biblical audience? So, remember, we talked about how it would be the first century AD, what it would have meant to the original readers. And so, I want you to read chapter 12, and I think you'll see it's talking about a big picture. It's talking about how there is a bigger spiritual war going on, and it involves Satan. He's the main henchman. He's the one who is the one who's the big boss man, you could call it. Anyway, so when it talks about this woman who had 12 stars and the sun and the moon and things like that, they would not have understood that image just as Mary, although it would have involved Mary certainly. Um, when you look at the woman, it's really interesting how it gives birth to Jesus. She gives birth to Jesus, the male child, and then she becomes the children. Notice that it's the children of God. So what I believe is going on here is that spiritual true remnant of Israel, the faithful community representing true Israel. So that's what I think is going on here. And as you can see, the male child is definitely identified, as we see. So after giving birth to the Messiah, that woman flees to a place of spiritual refuge for a period of 1260 days, time of very intense persecution. Basically, that's what's being discussed there. All right. And then we see, of course, the dragon is explicitly called Satan, right? The one who is the enemy, the devil, the accuser of our brethren. It says the male child will rule the nations with this iron scepter, which is definitely taken from Psalm 2, verse 9. So we see how it's interesting how it, in that one verse, it gives the life and the work of the Messiah all in that one verse, because it says he ascended to the throne, right? Because that's what happens at the end of Jesus' life. He ascends to the throne. John's audience would have understood this war in heaven and the rage of Satan as an explanation of 3 realities, as seen here. God has defeated Satan and the victory is certain. We see God's people on earth will continue to suffer as victims of the dragon's rage, and they can participate in the victory and overcome the devil by their obedience to the gospel message. So what are the similarities and the differences between the original audience and the audience of today? Well, the original audience certainly was looking forward to the second coming of Jesus Christ, just like we are. We are looking forward to the second coming of Jesus Christ. I think it needs to be said, though, when you read the context of Revelation, like I said, I believe in the early date. So I think part of the book of Revelation is dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And in a sense, that was a coming of Jesus. It was a figurative coming. But we are looking forward to the literal coming of Jesus Christ. 1 Corinthians 15 and 1 Thessalonians 4 and many other passages bear that out. Because we share this with the original audience, we can too expect to suffer for our faith. However, we're not part of, depending on the early date or the late date, Nero's Roman Empire or Domitian's Roman Empire. So our suffering will take another form. We're not, being fed to the lions, for example. But there are temptations that are similar, right? There's complacency. There is, we could be like Laodicea. We can become lukewarm. There's compromise. There's idolatry, false teaching, materialism that are still common as of today. And we need to be warned about those things and be warned of the dangers of those evils. Step 3, what are the theological principles in this text? Well, we know that there's a real devil that is opposed to God and is determined to deceive and destroy God's people. Satan has been defeated by the life and redemptive work of Christ. Christians can overcome the devil by living and proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ, by staying faithful. And we can expect to suffer for being faithful in the sense in their... Now, the word witness, like we talked about that word witness before. Now, and maybe I should just put Christians can expect to suffer by being faithful to Christ. The word witness, like I was talking about, or in the book of Acts, it means to that they were doing these miraculous things and they were able to testify. They were being directly led by the Holy Spirit. And we can't be a witness in that sense. But I guess in some sense we can become be a witness in a sense that as a martyr if we had to die for our faith. So that's something that we could think about there. How does our theological principles fit with the rest of the Bible? Well, Bible clearly affirms the existence of Satan, like in the book of Job and Genesis. In fact, I think it's really interesting how in the book of Revelation it identifies finally, explicitly, the serpent as Satan. We don't really get an idea of who that is until we get to Revelation. So I think it's really interesting from Genesis to Revelation. There's the purposes of Satan of opposing God and his people, and how Christians triumph over Satan through faithfulness to Christ. Be sober, be vigilant. For your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. And it even points to the point of being willing to suffer. Step 5, how should individual Christians today live out these theological principles? So look at number 3, for example. Christians can overcome the devil by living faithfully and proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ. There are several common elements, right, that we see there. Christians experience victory over the devil, living and proclaiming the gospel of Christ, even under the threat of death. That still can apply today. So we need to recognize that there is real-world situations where that might happen today. Okay. We might say the purpose of Revelation is to answer the question, who is Lord? And I think it's really interesting that Will Durant does say this. He says, there is no greater drama in human record that the sight of a few Christians scorned and oppressed by a succession of emperors, bearing all trials with a fierce tenacity, multiplying quietly, building order while their enemies generated chaos, fighting the sword with the word, brutality with hope, and at last defeating the strongest state that history has known. Caesar and Christ had met in the arena, in the Colosseum, you could say, and Christ had won. Indeed, the story of Revelation is that God won. So the question is, which side am I going to be on? The victor or the vanquished? Now, we're going to journey to the Old Testament. We're going to try to interpret this. So we're going to look at narrative, law, poetry, prophets, wisdom. And we know that some of these are a combination in some sense. But let's look at those. All right. So we know that the Old Testament contains various genres, right? And we know that the genre differences between the Old Testament and New Testament are, they're pretty different. In the New Testament, we saw history, we saw Gospels, letters, and then, of course, Revelation, apocalyptic literature. We do see that the situation is quite different, between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So we have to read the Old Testament from the vantage point of a Christian. Okay, we shouldn't read it from the standpoint of Old Testament Hebrews. And this is why sometimes it is harder to make application. But here's the thing. We have to recognize that there may be some things in the Old Testament that we just can't apply today, okay? We saw that in the New Testament. We saw that there was miraculous gifts that were given, that early Christians were performing these miraculous functions, and to be honest, we just can't do those things. Now, when it says, for example, in 1 Thessalonians, test all things, hold fast to that which is good, well, that meant something originally to them that does not mean to us today, and that they had that miraculous gift of discerning the spirits where they could test apostles and find that they are not apostles. But today we have the whole Bible and we can test people by the whole truth. Okay, so that's how I would reapply that. Okay, but we're going to use those 5 steps just like we did with the New Testament. So let's start with narrative or story. Narrative is a literary form characterized by sequential time action and involving plot, setting, and characters. Narrative is a story form of literature and the words will be used interchangeably. The meaning of a narrative derives primarily from the action of its characters, and rather than telling us how to live or how not to live, the narrative shows by the actions of its characters. For example, we know that when God tells us through Moses the story of Abraham, well, as we read through the story of Abraham, we notice what we can learn from that. that we're to how we're to live by faith, how we're to trust God. So we believe that these are true historical events, and archaeology has certainly given us great illumination, if I may use that word, and bearing on the authenticity of of a lot of these stories, a lot of these historical accounts. So, but let's talk about narrative. Okay, so advantages of using narrative to communicate theological truth. We think about how narrative stories are interesting for both when we're children, but also when we're adults. Okay, it pulls us into the action of the story, and it usually depicts real life and that's easy to relate to. And we find ourselves asking what we would have done in that situation. Narratives can portray the ambiguities and the complexities of life. Narratives are easy to remember. God can include himself, of course, the main character of the Bible is God. Thus, he can teach us about himself and what he says and does in the specific situations of the narrative. We see that they are presenting a bigger picture, We see how the characters, they struggle, but we often see the resolution of their struggles. And it relates short incidents and events that fit into the bigger overall story. Now, the disadvantages of using narrative to communicate theological truth. The meaning of the narrative can be subtle. It might be hard to try to figure it out. Or it's ambiguous and it's not clearly stated, and we may sadly miss the meaning sometimes. The reader can get engrossed with the narrative as a story and miss the spiritual meaning. The reader may assume that since the literature is narrative, it deals only with the history of that situation, does not actually deal with theology. The reader may read too much theology into it, and they sort of allegorize it, just like we talked about with Origen and the walls of Jericho, for example. Reading narrative. All right, so fundamental to interpreting narrative is reading the passage carefully, noticing the small details and surrounding passages to put the story into context. As with our study of interpreting other sections of Scripture, look for repetition, comparison, contrast, that movement from general to specific, list, things like that. We want to use our observation skills, right? Notice the small details and ask why these details are there. Reading narrative as an example. And I when I was reading this textbook, I never did realize this, and so I'm glad that they brought this out. But when they're going to talk about the first 7 chapters of Joshua, and I think it's really interesting that we see there are 2 characters that are being comparison and contrast. So first we have Rahab in chapter 2. She's a Canaanite prostitute who shows faith and is spared along with her family, right? Or all those who are with her. The Israelites have been told to destroy everyone in the promised land. And so we find an exception, though, in the saving of Rahab. In the chapter 7, after the conquest of Jericho, we're introduced to the Hebrew, named Achan, who sadly disobeys God because he takes the spoil, which God said that spoil was to be for him, but he takes it for himself. So Rahab is saved because of her faith in God. She acts on her faith. She trusts God and acts on her faith. Achan and all his household are put to death because of his disobedience. So we're going to see, is there a connection between these stories? We see the contrast, and I think we do. So here, let's look at all of these parallels. So you have a woman and a man, a Canaanite and a Hebrew, a prostitute, and a respectable Israelite, so to speak, should have been killed but survived and prospered, and she's actually in the lineage of Jesus Christ. Achan should have prospered but was killed. Her family and all that she owned survived, but his family and all that he owned sadly perished. The nation perishes in Jericho. The nation prospers after, of course, they obey God and executing this man. We see he hides the spies from the king. And I thought this was really interesting. This is why I thought this is a good parallel. Achan hides the spoil under his tent. She fears the God of Israel, but sadly he does not fear the God of Israel. She has only heard of God, and yet she does believe, and she acts on that faith. And what's sad is he's seen the acts of God, but he still disobeys. Her house survives while the city is burned, and his tent, sadly, is burned. There's the cattle, sheep, and donkeys of Jericho perish. The cattle, sheep, and donkeys of Achan perish. Um, Rahab becomes like an Israelite and lives, and he becomes like a Canaanite and he dies. She's faithful and obedient, but he is faithless and disobedient. So I thought that was some good parallels. All right, now let's talk about the 4 elements of narrative. We're going to talk about plot first. So we're talking about questions like what and how. And this feature that ties individual episodes together to form a larger story. So we have exposition, basic setting describing in the main sequence of events begins. The conflict, it can be internal within the character or be external between 2 characters or between 2 nations. Conflict is often between God and, sadly, people who are stubborn, right? And then there's a resolution. The story rises to a climax where the conflict is resolved. And when we ask, what's the story about? And we trace the movement of events. What's the main conflict? How's the conflict developed? How's the conflict resolved? All right, so we got the plot. Now let's talk about the setting. Expansion of when and where questions, right? Setting is important because it provides the backdrop to the story. So there's 2 basic components, the time, where it fits into the context of history, and then there's the place, the setting of the place. It could be in the promised land, it could be in another country, right? Like Egypt, for example. In Ruth 1:1, it says, in the days when the judges ruled there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judea went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. See, that gives us the time and the setting, right? And remember, when we read the book of Judges, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It's a story of, sadly, Israel just getting themselves into deeper and deeper trouble because they disobey God and they turn themselves over to idols. So it would have been dangerous for 2 women traveling alone, like Ruth and Naomi, after their husbands die. So the time setting underscores how unlikely it would have been to find a pious man like Boaz. And then it says a man of Bethlehem in Judah who went to sojourn in the country of Moab. And what's interesting is there's a famine going on. So possibly why there's a famine was because of Deuteronomy 27:28, because of disobedience to God, and that's one of the consequences. And in the Old Testament, leaving the promised land usually indicated a lack of faith and trust in God. Okay, so are the calamities related to the family leaving the land? Are the later blessings related to the return to the land of promise? Is there a theological principle here? Okay, so that's something you need to think about. All right, then we have plot. We got setting, characters. All right, characters answer the who question. They carry out the action and move the plot forward. The meaning of the story is usually tied to the behavior of one or more of the characters in the story. And the authors do not always communicate what the characters are thinking or feeling, which can leave us gaps and ambiguities, right? So continue. Let's think about 2 Samuel 10-12. We got Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba. What was he thinking through all of this? We sadly see how David committed adultery with Bathsheba, but we want to know, David tries to get him to go home to see his wife. He tries to get even him to get drunk, right? But how can we understand Uriah's behavior when David calls him back from the war? So I think it's, how would Uriah feel if he found out about all of this? We just don't know. We never know because, the inspired writer's not telling us what Uriah was thinking or feeling. All right, then there's the viewpoint of the narrator. And so we got to recognize the narrator's inspired, so he's going to give us the right information. So like 2 Kings 17:7, and this occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God. So the reason that there's the fall of Israel, the northern kingdom, was because they had sinned against the Lord, and God delivers them into the hands of the Assyrians. However, the narrator often stays neutral with the meaning being conveyed with an implicit meaning. In such a case, he expects the reader to understand the good and the bad in the story and make his own judgments. So consider Judges 21:25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Okay? And what's really interesting is, that story about Gibeah, we need to see a backdrop going on here. We see that this story is very parallel to Sodom and Gomorrah and what happened there. And so certainly we see a callback to the book of Genesis and how we should be interpreting this story, right? All right, reading narrative, doing comparisons and contrasts. So opening chapters of First Samuel, they're situated around Hannah and Eli, and the contrast between Samuel, who is the son of Hannah, and Eli's sons Hophni and Phinehas. We see Hannah's life is blessed with Samuel. Eli's life is sadly plagued because of his corrupt sons, right? Samuel rises to prominence and replacing Eli priests instead of Eli's sons. But we see in 1 Samuel the longest contrast is between David and Saul, right? We see Saul's introduction, how his outward appearance is emphasized because he stands taller than and shoulders than any. He has these. He's very, tall looking, and then we see how David's introduction is kind of interesting because it focuses on his inward character. Right, God looks at the heart, and then we see Saul's fear, and we see David's courage, how he fights against Goliath of Gath. And then there's reading narrative, and that we see the irony in narratives. Irony is the literary term used to describe situations where the literal or surface meaning of an event is quite different, sometimes totally opposite of the author's real intended meaning. Not meant to hide, but to present the meaning with more force. So many times a character fails to see beyond the surface implication. So let's think about 1 Samuel 5 and 6. There's those foolish sons of Eli, and they don't consult God. They carry the Ark of the Covenant into the battle with the Philistines, right? And they kind of present it like it's a good luck charm. And the Philistines defeat the Israelites, capture the Ark, and they think they not only defeated the Israelites, but they've also captured their God. So, defeated their God. So they placed the Ark of the Covenant in the temple of their god Dagon. Dagon fails to its face each day before the ark, which is very ironic, right? So such dreadful things occur that the Philistines offer gold and gifts to have the ark returned to Israel. And on the surface, Philistines think they won the war, but in reality, when we look at it, it's the case that the Lord did defeat the Philistines on their own turf, right? So I think that's kind of interesting. And then let's talk about the literary context, the big story. So we locate the episode we're studying in the context of the narratives that surround it. Okay, how does the story relate to the overall plot of the book? How does the story fit into the big picture narrative of the entire book? Interpretations that do not fit the overall story, they're probably not correct. Okay, consider Numbers 14, which describes the children of Israel. They rebel in refusal to go in to possess the land of Israel, or the land that God has given to them. How does this event relate to the larger narrative of God's promise to Abraham? Well, the fact that God told Abraham and thereby his children that they would inherit this land. They'd be given this land. So they should have faith that God is going to give them what he had promised them, and that they have been delivered from the Egyptians so that they could go into the promised land. And sadly, those Israelites did not want the land if they have to fight for it. So sadly, this is the climax of their disobedience. When we go back to 2 Samuel 11 and 12, we see an incident that taken out of context can give a misleading picture. So after David's sin with Bathsheba, Nathan the prophet comes to him and confronts him with his sin. David acknowledges his sin. He fervently repents, right? God forgives him, and he does marry Bathsheba. David musters his army, returns to battle where he should have been from the beginning. But if we leave the story there, we left with the impression that all is well. Now, what's really interesting is when Nathan gave that parable, I want to read something to you. I think that's kind of interesting. Second Samuel 11, 12. So when Nathan reacts to the parable, here's what he says. So David's anger, verse 5. So David's anger was greatly aroused against the man. He said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this shall surely die, and he shall restore, notice this, fourfold for the lamb because he did this thing and because he had no pity. Of course, Nathan responds by saying, "You are the man." So the big picture is actually different. Not all is well, because we see how the first 10 chapters, they give the rise to David's power, but then it shows how David sadly uh, commits this wicked sin. And starting with 2 Samuel 13, the second half describes how things go terribly wrong for David, especially with his children. Okay? So it's very important that you get the bigger picture. All right, guidelines for putting stories into the larger context. Okay, be aware of the overall story of the Old Testament. Explore how the character or episode you're studying fits into the big picture. Study the overall themes and message of the book of the Bible your episode is in. Read a summary statement of the book in a good Bible dictionary. If possible, read the entire book yourself. Look for connections between the episode you're studying and the rest of the book. What role does your episode play in the overall plot of the book? So if we're studying Abraham, read all of the Abrahamic narrative, right? Genesis 12 through 25. See how each event is connected to the overall story. So it's that's what we want to do, is read things in context. All right, implying that interpretive process. So let's go back to Rahab and Achan, okay? So when we look at the 5 steps, grasp the meaning of the text of the biblical audience, right? Analyze the context, look for connections, contrasts, comparisons. We gave that list, and we gave those comparisons and contrasts, okay? Determine the difference between the biblical audience and us. And we did that, right? We looked at how there's a man, a woman, and how she was a harlot, and how he was he was supposed to be a respectable citizen, and so forth. What's the theological principle in the text? Okay, so what is God looking for? I think it's really interesting. How does the principle fit with the rest of the Bible? Does the New Testament modify or qualify this principle? And if so, how? How should individual Christians today live out this modified theological principle? And maybe I could try to present it this way. So I just had something that came to my mind that I thought was a good principle. The Bible. So we know that the Bible teaches we're saved by grace, God's grace, through an obedient faith. Okay, so we don't deserve God's gift of salvation. What we deserve, as the Bible says, the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life in Jesus Christ our Lord. And so here, Rahab, she had faith in God. She trusted in God. She obeyed God, and she was saved. God is not a respecter of persons, right? And Achan, he's a man who was in the community, but he chose to disobey God. And it kind of relates to, in some sense, okay, let's say that you grew up in the church. And I use that because we don't really, we're added to the church. But, we grow up going to worship, right, with our parents. And it might be the case that we go Sunday, we go Wednesday nights. We're learning about God. But what if it's the case that we never truly, we never trust and obey the gospel, okay? And we hear it day in, day out, and yet we don't act on it. We don't obey what Jesus said. My friend, you're lost in sin. But let's say there is a Christian who shares the gospel with somebody who's never been to worship, and they trust and obey the gospel. Are they going to be saved? Yes, because God is no respecter of persons. Okay, so I think about that in regards to this Rahab and Joshua thing. All right, now let's give our attention to law, okay? So I'm going to stop there, and then we'll continue.